So just over about 2 months ago, I purchased the brand new Okay. So about 2 months ago, I actually purchased the... Okay, I get it. So about 2 months... All right, I get it. Yeah, so 2 months ago, I bought the Red Komodo, and since then, everybody has dropped a new camera, making me question, was I buying this camera for all the wrong reasons, and did I get sucked into the hype? What's good, creative fam? Brandon Washington here, and as I tried to say at the beginning of this, 2 months ago, I actually purchased the brand new Red Komodo, and I've been shooting with this camera a lot since. Now, for a quick reference, this was my first Red purchase. However, it was not the first time I actually have shot with Red. I've been on a couple different sets using Red, renting them for my projects and then assisting other people with their projects. And when working with Red, it is a completely different workflow than what most creators are used to. And so with all these new cameras coming out and now actually shooting quite a few projects and getting enough Red content underneath my belt, I figured it was a good time to do my full 2-month review on the Red Komodo. So let's start with probably what everybody's favorite part, but no one actually wants to admit is their favorite part, the gear itself. Now, currently the way I run with my Red Komodo is with this awesome Pelican case build that I put together. Inside this case is pretty much everything that I use, which includes the actual Red Komodo itself. I shoot all my Red Komodo projects on my CineZine Prime set. So this is gonna be a 24mm, a 50mm, and an 85mm cinema lens. Also inside this kit, you're gonna find my follow focus system, which is something that I do use all the time. Also inside this case is gonna be my massive battery collection. Now, there are a couple different ways that I have found to power this camera. My favorite right now actually has to be the Anton Bauer mini batteries. They're mini V-mount batteries and they're absolutely amazing. I recently got these from Anton Bauer, so shout out to those guys for sending those out. But I'm really loving them. They keep the entire package nice and small and really easy for me to film with. The other big reason why I like having all this stuff packed away into the Pelican case is it just has all of my additional accessories there. So that is probably one of the biggest things when it comes to working with a Komodo is you are always going to be rigging this camera up and down. In my first 2 months, I thought I was pretty much just gonna run it as a single rig and be good to go with that. But I quickly realized that based on the project, I was constantly changing the way this camera was being rigged out. Sometimes it was being rigged out with matte boxes and big lenses, big battery solutions and all of that. And then sometimes I was scaling it almost completely down just to the camera body itself, a small light lens and a little battery on the back so I could fly it on a gimbal like the Ronin S2. But now let's talk about what's really important. Some of the projects that I've actually shot with this camera. Now, once I actually got this camera, I already had a project lined up to shoot it with this camera. And it was a 4-part mini series. And in this series, we were shooting 4 different businesses. On each of these sets, we were gonna be using a teleprompter, and then we were gonna be having to capture B-roll. Now, setting up this camera on set was actually very easy. The only thing that's kind of a little bit of a learning curve is just knowing that when you get to set, you're going to have to actually calibrate your camera. Now, black shading your camera takes about 2 to 3 minutes each time, and then you add in an additional 2 minutes for the camera to actually turn on. So you're looking at 5 minutes before you're really ready to start shooting, and that's assuming that getting it out of the bag or out of the case, it's ready to go. Setup does take more time with this camera, but the images are absolutely amazing. As far as I can say that I've shot with a lot of cameras, as we know, in the last couple months, and I can say that the Red Komodo's image is still by far my favorite. Now, another thing that I really love about this camera is, yes, it is a super 35mm sensor, but it's actually slightly wider than super 35mm. So this allows me to actually get a slightly wider frame when I'm capturing my image. But what I like about that is then, because I'm capturing in 6K, I can still do punch in and punches out, even when working in a 4K timeline. Now, one of the big reasons why I also purchased this camera was for that Red RAW R3D RAW workflow. Now, the reason why I wanted this workflow was because there are a lot of times when I'm working with certain clients where time is of the essence. And this saved me on a project not too long ago. So I was shooting a project for a client and we had some pretty big wigs in the room. In the company that this was for, this was basically everyone just under the CEO and their entire board of operations. And we were shooting kind of a funny video. And what we had was very limited time. The problem with that was I wasn't able to get my settings all the way dialed in for every single shot because we were moving so quickly. But knowing that I had RAW, I just made sure that I got as close as I possibly could. I knew my white balance was slightly off and I knew the exposure wasn't exactly perfect, but I made sure that nothing was clipping, that I hadn't lost any detail in the shadows, and because I was working in RAW, I knew I was going to be able to adjust my ISO in post in order to get the perfect exposure. And because again, I was working in RAW, I was able to dial in my white balance perfectly. This basically gave me the ability to really save a couple shots in post. And I know typically we try not to have to do that, but sometimes you're just in those situations where you have to just save it in post because you don't have the time to get everything just perfect in camera. And I can say, especially for a project like this, working with a nice company and working with some people who had some very tight deadlines and time restraints, it was nice to be able to rely on that R3D RAW in order to get those shots looking good. Now, the next big thing that really comes up when you start working with a camera from a long period of time is the workflow. Now, working with the Red Komodo is super simple. I mean, it uses CFast cards and there are pretty much CFast readers all over the internet. And yes, CFast cards are a bit expensive, but they are a lot cheaper than Red's original Red Mag cards that work with all of their other Red Cinema cameras. So it is nice to be able to work with these CFast workflow. Another nice thing about this camera is that it shoots in now 3 different levels of RAW. You have LQ, MQ, and HQ. And I've been shooting almost all of my projects in RAW LQ. And what I love about this is that it doesn't take up a ton of space. On a 512 gigabyte CFast card, you can shoot for over an hour in RAW LQ. And I find that for most of my projects, that is plenty of space. This is not only gonna save me when it comes to having to swap cards in the middle of a project, but this also saves me a ton when it comes to editing the project later. I'm not running through hard drives for every single project. LQ is actually so nice to work with that a lot of times, even for this YouTube channel, I will be shooting like, BTS or extra content or, shots of products with the Red because the LQ is so nice to work with. By no means do I regret this camera. I still love filming with it, but I do have a better understanding for it now. And there's a reason why I kind of pushed off this review for a little bit. I wanted to make sure that with a camera like this and with a price point like this, that I wasn't leading anybody astray. I understand that this is a very specialty type camera, and honestly, I love it. And this one of the big reasons is because I wanted it. I wanted to shoot Red. If you are on the fence whether you should pick up this camera or not, first, I strongly recommend that you rent it first. You really do need to get your hands on it and get a good test for it and see if it's not just something that you want, but it's not very practical for you, or maybe it is something that is very practical, but you also want it. So then it's a good buy. At the end of the day, you have to do what's best for your production. And if you get into the boat like me, where you say, I just want it, I just want the camera, then it's totally okay. I personally think that's a completely justifiable reason to buy a camera, but only if it makes sense for you financially. So don't put yourself in the hole for this camera. Buy it when it's good for you, buy it when you can. And if you do ever want to rent this camera, I strongly recommend you do it because it is a fantastic camera to work with. I know a lot of you guys have been asking me for some comparison videos with this camera versus like the Blackmagic and a couple other cameras. I'm definitely working on those projects now. They take a lot more time than you might think to compare 2 cameras side by side, but we are working on some projects like that. But if you guys have any additional questions about the Red Komodo or really anything, leave those questions down below in the comment section and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.